I never intended to fall asleep in my car that afternoon, because the plan had been simple and ordinary, the kind of plan people make without thinking twice. Just a quick stop at the grocery store after a long workday to grab a few essentials before heading home. But the day had stretched longer than expected, filled with small delays, back-to-back responsibilities, and that quiet mental exhaustion that builds not from drama, but from repetition. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot, parked farther away from the entrance where there was less traffic and fewer distractions, and turned the engine off, I realized how heavy my body felt, how my shoulders slumped the moment the hum of the car faded into silence, and how the simple act of sitting still felt like relief rather than laziness. The parking lot itself was unremarkable in every way. A wide-open stretch of asphalt marked by faded white lines and dotted with shopping carts that had drifted away from their corrals, surrounded by the usual mix of vehicles belonging to people running errands, employees finishing shifts, and parents juggling grocery bags and restless kids. And nothing about my presence there was unusual or out of place, because people sat in their cars all the time, checking their phones, eating snacks, waiting for someone, or simply taking a moment to breathe before rejoining the world. And I was doing no more than that, except my eyes closed before I realized it had happened. It wasn't the kind of sleep that pulls you deep into dreams, but the shallow, drifting rest that comes when exhaustion outweighs intention, where sounds still register faintly and time stretches without definition. And for a while I floated in that in-between state, vaguely aware of distant car doors slamming, the squeak of shopping cart wheels, and the low murmur of traffic beyond the lot, until something sharp cut through the haze. A sudden knocking sound that didn't belong to the background noise, loud enough to jolt my awareness back into my body before I even opened my eyes. The knocking came again, harder this time, urgent and insistent, and when I finally blinked awake, disoriented and confused, my heart jumped as I saw a figure standing uncomfortably close to my driver's side window. A woman leaning forward as if trying to see inside my car, her posture stiff, her jaw set, her expression already loaded with judgment before I had even had a chance to understand what was happening. And I felt that immediate, instinctive rush of anxiety that comes from being abruptly confronted while vulnerable, especially when you're alone and unsure what the person wants. I rolled the window down just enough to speak, still shaking off the fog of sleep, and before I could even ask if something was wrong, she spoke first, her voice sharp and accusatory, telling me that I couldn't sleep there, that this was a grocery store parking lot, not a place for people to loiter or nap, as if she were enforcing a rule she had personally written. And I remember blinking at her, trying to process the absurdity of the situation, because nothing about what I was doing felt wrong or dangerous, or even noticeable, until she had decided to make it an issue. I explained calmly that I had been tired, that I was resting for a few minutes before going inside or driving home. But she dismissed my explanation instantly, scoffing as though she had heard it all before, her eyes scanning the interior of my car in a way that felt invasive rather than concerned. And then she said something that shifted the entire interaction, from awkward to unsettling, suggesting that I could be on drugs, that I could be dangerous, that I could be watching people or planning something. And the words hit me with a mix of disbelief and quiet anger, because none of that was true, and none of it was based on anything more than her discomfort with my presence. When she told me she had already called the police, the moment crystallized into something heavier, something that carried real consequences, because calling the police isn't a small gesture. It's a decision that introduces authority, risk, and escalation into a situation that didn't require any of those things. And as she stood there, clearly convinced she had done the right thing, I realized that, in her mind, I had already been transformed from a tired person into a potential threat simply by existing in a way she didn't approve of. I rolled my window back up without responding, because there was nothing left to say that would change her mind, and I sat there waiting, my pulse steady, but my thoughts racing, aware of how powerless the situation suddenly felt, how easily someone else's assumptions could override my reality, and how strange it was that something as harmless as resting had become grounds for suspicion, while she lingered nearby, watching me closely, arms crossed, as if she were guarding against an escape that was never planned. When the police car eventually pulled into the parking lot, moving slowly without sirens or flashing lights, the atmosphere shifted again, the presence of law enforcement turning the ordinary space into something tense and official. And as the officer approached my car, his demeanor calm and professional, I felt a cautious sense of relief mixed with lingering frustration, because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, Yet I was still the one being questioned, still the one having to explain myself. The officer asked me what was going on, and I told him simply that I had taken a nap because I was tired, that I didn't feel safe driving while exhausted, and that I had been parked legally the entire time, and he listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. His reaction so reasonable and grounded that it highlighted just how unnecessary the situation had been in the first place. And when he confirmed that it wasn't illegal to sleep in your car in a grocery store parking lot, I felt a weight lift from my chest, even as irritation simmered beneath the surface. The woman, however, was not satisfied, and she stepped forward to argue her case, insisting that I had been unconscious, that I could have been intoxicated, that allowing people to sleep in cars would somehow invite crime, and as she spoke, it became increasingly clear that her concern wasn't about safety at all, but about control, about deciding who belonged and who didn't. And the officer's patience began to wear thin as he explained, calmly but firmly, that calling emergency services for non-issues was not appropriate, that there had been no threat, and that I was within my rights to be there. Watching the interaction from inside my car, I felt strangely detached, as though the conversation were happening around me rather than about me, and that realization lingered long after the officer told me I was free to go, that I could stay or leave as I chose, because it underscored how little my actual humanity had mattered in the process, how quickly I had been reduced to a problem to be handled rather than a person to be understood. I chose to leave, not because I had to, but because the space no longer felt neutral. And as I drove away, I caught a final glimpse of the woman standing there, clearly displeased that her authority had been challenged, and I couldn't shake the discomfort of knowing how easily the outcome could have been different if circumstances, perceptions, or biases had shifted even slightly. Later, lying in my own bed, the events replayed in my mind with an unsettling clarity, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of how ordinary it all was, how plausible, how reflective of a larger pattern where rest, stillness, or difference are interpreted as threats rather than human needs. And I thought about how many people experience similar situations not as rare interruptions, but as regular occurrences, moments where they are forced to justify their existence in public spaces. I didn't stop taking naps in my car when I needed to, because fatigue doesn't disappear just because someone else disapproves. But I became more aware of my surroundings, more conscious of how quickly perception can turn against you, and that awareness stayed with me, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most unsettling encounters aren't loud or violent or overtly hostile, but subtle, rooted in assumptions, and capable of transforming a simple moment of rest into an unnecessary confrontation. And that, more than the police or the argument or the parking lot itself, was what stayed with me long after the day ended, the understanding that in the real world, being tired isn't always allowed to be just that, and that sometimes simply existing without explanation is enough to make someone else uncomfortable enough to call it a problem.